much, Julia. I am thrilled to be here to introduce Sharon Olds and Mark Doty. We're going to begin with readings. Sharon Olds followed by Mark's reading, and then we'll have a conversation. Sharon Olds' first book, Satan Says, received the inaugural San Francisco Poetry Center Award. Her second, The Dead and the Living, was both the Lamont Poetry Selection and winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award. Her collections include Stag's Leap, which was the recipient of the Pulitzer Prize and the T.S. Eliot Prize. Her numerous honors include an NEA grant, a Guggenheim, former New York State Poet Laureate. She teaches in the graduate creative writing program at NYU. In 2016, she received the Wallace Stevens Award. Academy of American Poets Chancellor Mark Doty said, "Sharon Olds has crafted a life's work, a remarkable power. The driving rhythms and artful structures of her poems are in service of a rigorous examination of her own life and the lives of those around her. By writing with such candor and clarity, Olds has granted younger poets, especially women, permission to speak. Her poems, in their evocation of trauma or desire, in their grief and joy and comedy, have opened new possibilities for poetry in our time. She is an American master and a national treasure." Please welcome Sharon Olds and Mark Doty.
Thank you, Kelly. Hi. I'm very honored to be here in this special place, on this special land, and with all these special people. Thinking of Stanley, honored to be here with Julia and Mark and Kelly and all of you. So I'm going to start with, in a way that I've certainly never started a reading, with a poem that that I've never read to anyone, and that I'm not sure any of us will be that happy that I have once I've read it, especially maybe me. But I could not resist, because after I had accepted Julia's invitation, I wrote this poem, same hour. And then you can see I've worked on it a lot, but whether enough or whether it could be saved in the long run, in any case, we don't know. But here it is. It's called Returning to the Ocean After 20 Years. We parted in our final parting on an island off the coast of the continent. And we didn't part sideways, we didn't hug, standing and release, marriage's breast and stomach and loins splitting away from itself. He stayed at the wheel and I came up out of the passenger door, rising like an upended levels bubble through its oil, or a person swimming up out of a drowned car. And then I walked to the plane, and the plane roared along the island surface and rose over sparkling, bouncing blue-green salt. A year later, divorce final, his wedding coming up. I was at some gate at some airport, and suddenly, above me, on a screen suspended on chains from the ceiling, a wave curled and broke on a beach, and a sob burst out of me. Our summer life had seemed to me permanent, a kept promise. After I'd endured my youth, I was entitled to bliss. And I did not go near the sea then for 20 years, lest a wave coil and ripple over. And now in a month I will go out on the long coiled spit set in that old whale-shorn water near Stanley's garden. And what was it about Stanley? I didn't feel ashamed of myself with him for my husband having left me for another woman, an older woman, I'd remind Stanley, then show him how I was coming along with my catwalk walk, the paws crossing way across each other. In his old age, I gave him a bobcat, very soft. He held it, and with his long wizard hand, he stroked it, and I purred as if my soul lay in God's lap in his province. And when I see a wave at the Cape, into Stanley's hands I will commend my spirit. Well, a poem with Stanley in it. It's partly that I feel at home here in a community of artists, that I can just pull out a new draft as I would with friends, and partly because if Stanley comes into a poem, that part of it at least I think is going to be fine. Diagnosis. By the time I was 6 months old, she knew something was wrong with me. I got looks on my face she had not seen on any child in the family, or the extended family, or the neighborhood. My mother took me in to the pediatrician with the kind hands, the doctor with a name like a suit size for a wheel, Hub Long. My mom did not tell him what she thought in truth, that I was possessed. It was just these strange looks on my face. He held me and conversed with me, chatting as one does with a baby. And my mother said, "She's doing it now. Look, she's doing it now." And the doctor said, "What your daughter has is called a sense of humor." "Oh," she said, and took me back to the house where that sense would be tested and found to be incurable. You can tell how excited I am. I have a trimmer anyway. It's like one of those harmless trimmers called a beneficent trimmer or something like that. A really good trimmer. But it's lively today. This is from Stag's Leap, and what I call an end of long marriage book. And this is called Known to be Left. If I pass a mirror, I turn away. I do not want to look at her, and she does not want to be seen. Sometimes I don't see exactly how to go on doing this. Often, when I feel that way, within a few minutes I am crying, remembering his body, or an area of it, his backside often, a part of him just right now to think of, luscious, not too detailed, and his back turned to me. After tears, the chest is less sore, as if some goddess of humanness within us has caressed us with a gush of tenderness. I guess that's how people go on, without knowing how. I am so ashamed before my friends to be known to be left by the one who supposedly knew me best. Each hour is a room of shame, and I am swimming, holding my head up, smiling, joking, ashamed, like being naked with the clothed. Or being a child, having to try to behave while hating the terms of your life. In me now, there's a being of sheer hate, like an angel of hate. On the badminton lawn, she got her one shot, pure as an arrow, while through the eyelets of my blouse, the no-see-ums bit the flesh no one seems now to care to touch. In the mirror, the torso looks like a pin-up hives martyr, or a cream pitcher speckled with henny bit and pussy paws, full of the milk of human kindness and unkindness, and no one is lining up to drink. But look, I am starting to give him up. I believe he is not coming back. Something has died inside me, believing that. Like the death of a crone in one twin bed, as a child is born in the other. Have faith, old heart. What is living anyway but dying? And I thought I would read 3 odes. Mark and I are going to each read for a portion, then we're going to have a conversation with Kelly, and then we're going to have a conversation all together. Ode to the Clitoris. Little eagerness, flower girl basket of soft thorn and petal, near the entry of the satin column of the inner aisle. Scout in the wilderness, wild ear which perks up, tender dowser which points, imp, shapeshifter, bench-pressing bicep of a teeny goddess who is buff, lotus for grief, wincy Minerva who springs full-armored, molten. I did not know you at 7. I thought you were God's way of addressing me when I kept swinging on the rings after the bell had rung. He didn't use his words, he used you to get my attention. He wrenched me and wrenched me then in 6 or 7 wrenches of my body and brain, you, the living wrench which winched the wrenches. Later, you would do that without God, with boys, with kisses, and later you'd become an instrument of love's music. Today, I saw your portrait for the first time, your dorsal vein, your artery, your cavernous body, your vestibular bulb, your suspensory ligament, and I could see how evolution got the idea from you to invent an organ something like you, but a lot bigger. You were named for a Greek hill, Klinine, a slope. You are the ground of our being, the tiny figure of the human, the hooded stranger who comes to the door, and if we bless her, we will be blessed. I don't actually know what an ode is because I was afraid if I looked them up I would find that I wasn't writing them, and I liked so much the idea that I was writing them that I kept writing them. So I call them odes. One of my favorite books in the last few years is Evie Shockley's The New Black. And her poem, and one of her poems from that book inspired this poem. Ode to My Whiteness. You were invisible to me. You went without saying. You were my weapon secret from myself. Whatever I got, you helped get it for me. You were my ignorance. Because of you, I was not innocent. I did not see that. You were my blinding light. My dreams had a blank area in the center, taking up most of the screen they played on in my sleep, a blazing circle that blanked out the core of the scene. I thought it was my mother's violence, but it was you, too. You, the unseen fat which fed me in the wilderness. You, my Masonic handshake. You, my stealth. You, my drone. You, my collaborator. You, my magician's cloak of steam. You, my dissembler. You, mine. I, yours. Irisless eyeball. You, my blindness. Inspiration of my helpless act. You, my silence. Evie's blackness, a dancer. you another, the two of you moving together. And I'll close my part with this. We're going to both read you a couple of poems at the end as well. And change chairs with my brilliant and passionate colleague and brother poet. Yes, I should say I didn't try to think of every thing or sensation or feeling that had not had an ode written about it and then try to write an ode about that. I really didn't, at least consciously I didn't. But once the poems of praise started just occurring to me, then they began to almost come in pairs. Ode to the Penis. Someone told me that what I write about men is objectifying. So I ask you, oh, general idea of the penis, do you mind being noticed? You who stand in the mind, erect and not, old and young, for all your representations, oh, abstract principle, haven't you maybe been waiting for your turn to be praised? I think you're lovely and brave, and so interesting. You are like a creature with your head and trunk, as if you have a life of your own. But you are innocent. You are not your own man. You are no more responsible for your actions than the matter of the brain for its thoughts. And you've had a mixed history. You've been taken into carnage as the instrument of it, and you yourself have been played to produce the desperate screams. Often you have not been protected, nor used to protect, and oft not been respected, nor wielded to respect. And yet most of your history has been spent in joy. And I wonder how it has felt being so adored as you have been and feared, and what it is like for you if you could look down from your platonic cloud of categories when two of you are engaged together or married, yourself primed, yourself to your own power. And being a concept, are you smart? Do you know you're equal to your sister concept, and even that you came from her back at the invention of the separate male, the ovaries heavying down towards the earth, the organ of orgasm growing and growing. I cannot imagine you from within, but as a sage said of a god, I do not want to be sugar, I want to taste sugar. But that's just my heteromania talking. And you're not homo or hetero or visible or manifest. You do not exist except as an imaginary quorum of all your instances. So I'm not flirting with you, I'm just saying I like you. Not as an object, but a subject, a prime mover, a working theory of plumbing and ecstasy, a boy's pride and anxiety, windsock of zephyr and gale, half of the equation of creation.
This is the place, I gather. Yeah, okay. Thank you. A couple of things I want to talk about briefly first. It's such an honor and a pleasure to read with Sharon. And I was very happy that Kelle quoted a statement that I wrote about Sharon's work when she received the Wallace Stevens Prize, talking about her as a permission giver, as someone who had made it possible for so many others to talk about crucial material in their lives. And you listen to that reading and you think, well, what is there that I can't talk about, right? Or what is there that I'm too ashamed of to say? Or that I might so dislike in myself that I will not give it words. And you've given so much to so many. That's extraordinary. So, that, and to be a person who makes any kind of art in Provincetown, and that's probably most of you, is to stand in a very lovely tradition. And we don't notice it at first, but the longer you're here, the more you look at these places where people walked away from the rest of the world, made their way out to the edge, out to the margin, and devoted themselves to making remarkable things. That it's a privilege to stand in that lineage, and I am so pleased that Stanley was evoked today too. And I think he keeps coming back in settings like this because not only was he profoundly devoted to his own patient work of making, but his generosity to other artists, to younger artists. When he was 99, I had a new book coming out, and I've always been a dream to have a quotation from Stanley on the back of the book. But I wasn't going to ask a 99-year-old man to write a blurb. I mean, please, he should be contemplating other things. But his assistant passed along my manuscript, and Stanley looked at it, and after a few days he said, "Mark, I'll blurb your next book," which wasn't. Takes me a few years, it was terribly likely. But you never know. But there is some way. In fact, he did blurb the book. But had he not, there is a way in which he would have anyway, by being exactly who he was in this place for all of us who would carry on that work. That's probably the best kind of blurb. Okay, so I'm going to read you some new poems, and one not so new. This one begins in thinking about new relationship and how we change our habits. We come to know the memories of another person, and that sort of becomes part of your life. And in this case, the poem is concerned with coming to know the pets of another person. And I had lived for many years with big dogs, with retrievers, and my partner now grew up with terriers. Yeah. So I have this alien species in my house, and this poem will introduce you to little George. The title of the poem flows right into the first line. Little George barks at whatever is not the world as he prefers to know it. Trash sacks, hand trucks, black hats, canes and hoods, bicycles, snow shovels, someone smoking a joint beneath the overhang of the Haitian evangelicals, anyone, how dare they, walking a dog. George barks, the tense white comma of himself arced in alarm. At home, he floats in the creaturely domestic, curled in the triangle behind a sleeper's knees, wiggling on his back on the sofa, all jelly and sighs, receiving a belly rub. No worries. But outside the apartment's metal door, the unmanageable day assumes its blurred and infinite disguises. Best to bark. No matter that he's slightly larger than a toaster, he proceeds as if he rules a rectangle 2 blocks deep, bounded west and east by 7th Avenue and Union Square. Whatever's there is there by his consent, and subject to the rebuke of his refusal. Though when he asserts his will, he trembles. If only he were not solely responsible for raising outcry at any ripple of trouble on West 16th, or if, right out on the pavement, he might lay down the clanking armor of his bluster. Some evening, when he's climbed the stairs after our late walk, and rounds the landing's turn and turns his way toward his steady sleep, I wish he might be visited by a dream of the world as kind. How any looming unreadable might turn out to hold the April green of an unsullied tennis ball? Dear one, surely the future is not entirely out to get us. And if it is, barking won't help much. But no such luck. At least not yet. He takes umbrage this morning at a stone image serene in a neighbor's garden and stiffens and fixes and sounds his wild alarm. Damn you, Buddha, get out of here. Go away. So after I'd finished that poem and read it a few times, I realized, well, it's really more a portrait of my partner than it is of George. And then I realized, no, it's really more about me, actually. So, which is always the case. Writing about dogs, you think you're writing about dogs? No, not people. So this one, 3 years ago now, I had one of those birthdays that ends in 0. And I was not much inclined to celebrate. You know, in the past, 30, 40 meant knowing oneself a little better. 50 was sort of a sense of solidity in the world. And I know intellectually that 60, well, that's just an opportunity. But my entire life, the culture has said, well, that's it for you. Forget it. The most energetic, dynamic, intellectually interesting, and some of the most sexy people I know are well over 60, and it still didn't work. I spent my day in bed, my birthday, and something helped in the long run. It would be useful to you to visualize or to know sky lanterns or fire balloons, those constructions of rice paper that you light a wick underneath, the thing swells up and floats. Elizabeth Bishop's from the Armadillo. She calls them frail, illegal fire balloons. And they're illegal for a good reason. They're very dangerous. They land. So they sometimes land on people's roofs and so on. But these were safely done. 60. Dangerous invitations, packed flat. 6 sky lanterns for my birthday. Rice paper sack glued at the seams, thin bamboo ring at bottom for a mouth, a wire armature holding a deck of cards, stack of paper, soaked in wax. Frail, illegal, we know. But this birthday ends in 0, a turn I'm not so inclined to celebrate. And who could resist a lantern lifted by its own flame, sailing out over an August night's black bay? At Land's End, no other car in sight. Only the deep, unfractioned evening bent down toward a horizon it erased. And here, in our flashlit circle, a blonde grass edge of dune, a bit of pavement, and just in case, a fire extinguisher. We huddle around the first, one for each decade past, one for the one to come. Unfold the paper shell, hold the opening level, touch a lighter to the wick, and feel in our 4 hands the thing swell, tugging upward, a bucking saffron lung we couldn't hold back a moment longer. Who knew, till that first one rose, how lovely this token would be, lit from within, ghosting its arc from side to side, hurrying into the smallest point it could become before it disappeared. And there were still 5 more to come, restless in our hands. My life wanted to be born again between us, to tear upward and become winking fire and make in air the shape it would make. This and no other. Write the night enormous. Is that what souls are for? Drunk on my birthday wine, and maybe having smoked a little too, you'd miscounted and hadn't brought one more for the years ahead. Thank you, love, for that. You'd meant to. But some instinct, wisdom, stayed your hand and left the last lantern folded and waiting on a shelf, the better part of your gift. Thank you very much. Thank you. I was very happy to hear as well your poem based on Evie's work. One of my colleagues at Rutgers, a terrific poet, and the examination of what whiteness is for us, what color is for us, seems so crucial now, and so much. I'm very pleased to see this on the mind of so many poets I know. I have been particularly outraged and left speechless, really, by the visibility of acts of violence, racially motivated violence, on the part of law enforcement officials in this country. We've all seen that. The videos that are, I don't know that there's more violence than there used to be, but it's certainly the documentation is there, right? The cell phone is a way of instantly recording and creating testimony. I was particularly struck by the murder of Tamir Rice, 12-year-old boy who was shot in Cleveland in 2014. He was playing with a plastic gun in the city park. So this one, which I will find in a second here, is called In 2 Seconds. And again, the title of the poem flows directly into the first line. In 2 seconds. The boy's face climbed back down the 12-year tunnel of its becoming. a charcoal sunflower swallowing itself. Who has eyes to see or ears to hear? If you could see what happens fastest, unmaking the human irreplaceable, a star falling into complete gravitational darkness from all points of itself, all this, the held, loved body, into which entered milk and music, honeying the cells of him, who sang to him, stroked the nape of the scalp, kissed the flesh knot after the cord completed its work of fueling into him the long history of those whose suffering was made more bearable by the as yet unknown of him, playing alone in some unthinkable future city, a Cleveland, whatever that might be. 2 seconds to elapse. The arc of joy in the conception bed, the labor of hands repeated until the hands no longer required attention, so that as the woman folded, her hopes for him sank into the fabric of his shirts and underpants. Down they go, swirling down into the maw of a greater dark. Treasure box, comic books, pocket knife, bell from a lost cat's collar. Why even begin to enumerate them when behind every tributary poured into him comes rushing backward all he hasn't been yet? Everything that boy could have thought or made, sung or theorized, built on the quavering but continuous structure that had preceded him, sank into an absence in the form of a boy playing with a plastic gun in a city park in Ohio in the middle of the afternoon. When I say 2 seconds, I don't mean the time it took him to die. I mean the lapse between the instant the cruiser lurched to a halt on the grass, between that moment and the one in which the officer fired his weapon. The 2 seconds taken to assess the situation. And though I believe it is part of the work of art to try on at least the moment and skin of another, for this hour I respectfully decline. I refuse it. May that officer be visited every night of his life by an enormity collapsing in front of him into an incomprehensible bloom, and the voice that howls out of it. If this is no poem, then... But that voice, erased boy, beloved of time, who did nothing to no one and became nothing because of it, I know that voice is one of the things we call poetry. It isn't to his killer he's speaking. And I'll end this little set with, you met George. This is my golden retriever, Ned. Deep Lane. June 23rd, evening of the first fireflies. We're walking in the cemetery down the road, and I look up from my distracted study of whatever, an unfocused gaze somewhere a few feet in front of my shoes, and see that Ned has run on ahead, with the champagne plume of his tail held especially high, his head erect, which is often a sign that he has something he believes he is not allowed to have. And in the gathering twilight, what is it that is gathered? Who is doing the harvesting? I can make out that the long horizontal between his lovely jaws is one of the 4 stakes planted on the slope to indicate where the backhoe will dig a new grave. Of course, my impulse is to run after him, to replace the marker, out of respect for the rule that we won't desecrate the tombs, or at least for those who knew the woman whose name inks a placard in the rectangle claimed by the 4 poles of vanishing, 3 poles now, and how it's within their recollection, their gathering, she'll live. Evening of memory, spark lamps in the grass. I stand and watch him go in his wild figure 8s. I say, you run, darling. You tear up that hill.
I wondered if we could start with a question. If you could talk about what it means to be a poet in these times, in this moment in American politics and history.
Well, you go first, Sharon.
What it means to be a poet?
How has it affected maybe your own poetry, or we've seen a resurgence in resistance-based poetry, but certainly there are many responses to this moment, and I was curious to hear about yours.
Well, I think that any of us who are artists are by the act of making something, are in protest against the nothing. It has to do with value. I think it's very hard for very many artists to feel that anything they're doing is valuable. I take this from my own experience. I hope I'm wrong. It would be just wonderful to think that most other artists wake up in the morning thinking, I'm going to make some more art and it's going to make a difference. But I'm not like that at all. I'm lucky when the inspiration comes to me. I do believe that our species itself depends on there being self-awareness, including of the worst of us, as well as the worst we're capable of, as well as the best. And I certainly believe in bearing witness. How often for me, a bearing witness poem doesn't work as a poem is sad to me. It often doesn't work. But that's just kind of the top layer of my feelings about that, Kelly. What?
I think that there is a kind of rotation that goes on in the life of poetry, and maybe in other arts as well, where we become, as a group of artists, formalists for a while. We get really interested in language itself, or in traditional form, or in taking words apart, or whatever kind of structures we make. And then what Wallace Stevens called the pressure of reality comes along and pushes on us, or slaps us in the head. And we're at a time when I think most of the poets I know felt galvanized. We have a responsibility to talk back, and it's largely about, it is about value. It's the kind of erasure you see around you. And so you hear a story like this little boy being shot in the park, and his sister, I couldn't even tell the whole story in the poem, his sister is not allowed to go to him. He doesn't die. He 2 seconds to get shot, but 8 hours to die in the hospital later. Outrageous, and the way that this act is excused, and part of a whole fabric of erasure of human value that we see around us. So this has been so heightened over the course of this administration's work, and every poet I know feels, I don't know that it changes anything, but feels the need to name. We are not allowed to be quiet about that, and so I find that very encouraging, the kind of value that then takes the place. To some degree, pushes those formal concerns aside. They will come back, and that cycle will probably continue. It's a healthy thing.
Thank you. Thank you.
As long as we're here to make poems.
Yes, yes. Well, the second question is the importance of writing the body. So, Mark, your second book, Bethlehem in Broad Daylight, was described as an argument for the paradise of the human. And Sharon in The New Yorker recently described you as a jubilantly physical poet renowned for rejoicing in the body. Your newest book of odes is centered on the body. Could you talk about the importance of writing the physical body in your poems?
You know, Whitman says, I too received identity of my body. He said in Crossing Brooklyn Ferry. He wants to say to his readers, it was just as you did, so did I become myself through being flesh. The two great shaping influences of my life have been desire and the problematic nature of same-sex desire in this culture, in the way one cannot deny the imperative of what you feel, and yet so much around you pushes against that imperative, tells you it's wrong, twists, distorts, etc. And then on top of that, an epidemic in which the source of pleasure became the source of destruction, the source of despair. My lover's body was the gate through which we came to deep intimacy, to a profound connection, and it was also the source of, you know, the greatest sorrow in my life. It tore us apart. So there you go.
Yes.
What else is there to talk about, right? Except being a body.
I go with that.
Okay. Poems from my head.
I'd like to talk about your new work. So I know we've talked a little bit about, Sharon, the odes that you've been reading from them. How did you come to write an entire book of odes?
Neruda's book, Odes to Everyday Things, fell out of a bookshelf into my then boyfriend's hands in an old used bookstore. And he said, here's some poetry. And it was facing page, and I don't have Spanish, but I had enough Latin and Italian that I could guess. And I loved the praise and the ordinary things, right, that were being praised. I was in a time of not writing much. I never thought, oh, I like this idea, I'll do this. I never think that. I think, oh, how brilliant, I could never do that. That's just, you know, that first stage. But then it just came into my mind like a month later, that I could, maybe, I could try to write a poem to some things that were ordinary to me, like a tampon. Mm-hmm. Now, it's not as if I grew up thinking that people were always being encouraged to write poems about tampons and were never doing it. I knew it was rude, and I knew that, but that didn't matter to me much compared to the possibility that it could be done without failing. I write a lot, and most of it fails. So I'm not a perfectionist, but I want to try. And so I tried, and I found that that poem, it changed my my meter, and it was just different. And so I think that made me happy, and then therefore some other ideas later came into my mind for other similar subjects.
Thank you. Do you feel like there's I just noticed so much humor in this book as well. Did you feel that because you were writing about the ordinary objects, or how did it just came naturally through the writing of them?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Humor comes naturally to me. And I think to all of us in terms of discrepancies and, you know, but yes.
It also feels like the humor in this one does some really important work about, here I am, the poet, praising something which is so often circumscribed, or we still talk about it, right? Mm-hmm. The tampon is a great example. It's a female thing. It's not clean. It's off on the edges. We don't want to talk about that. And if you just praise it, there's a way in which that, in an earnest way, I can imagine that poem not connecting to it. The jokes somehow letting jokes is too broad. You know, the wit in the poem allows you to do more as a speaker. You connect things more, you draw things. I'm not saying this very well, but I think it's a really important aspect of the poems.
And I'm saying to the reader, I know this isn't supposed to be talked about, but we know that, you know, lots of things aren't supposed to be talked about.
We know how much of a human experience
you and me.
Put over there. Confessional poets write about that.
Right. Yeah. Right.
They're amazing poems.
Thank you, Laura.
Did you know that the Unitarian Universalist Church in Provincetown supposedly began when the Waves spit up a copy of a Unitarian book at one point? Some children were playing and they brought the book back and people passed it around.
How wonderful.
Maybe this is true. So this happened to you.
Cool.
It's a wonderful story. So Mark, you're currently at work on a memoir that centers on your poetic relationship with Walt Whitman, entitled "What Is the Grass?" Can you tell us a little about the project?
I've not always loved Whitman, but interested in Whitman, and at some point that interest sort of caught fire. It became personal to the degree, not only did I see him as a sensibility I felt so close to, but he was kind of becoming present, you know? I went to Whitman's house in Camden, New Jersey, and it's you know, kind of what you would expect, a collection of testimonials and engraved photographs of important dinners and so on. And suddenly I came upon a box on a shelf. It looked like a Joseph Cornell box. It was a bird behind glass. It was Whitman's stuffed parrot, a newer little parrot. Glass eyes and a little moth-eaten. And I believe that we slip out of ourselves with some frequency, you know, that you can sort of slide out of your own identity. I suddenly had this moment of, looking at the neck and shoulder of an old man. His skin was pink as if he'd just come out of the bath. I could smell it, that sort of talcum powder smell. I was his bird sitting on his shoulder, and that was my companion. And what was that, you know? And it was, for me, the beginning of another kind of relationship with him. So the book is about his work, why it is utterly brilliant and lastingly radical and ultimately frustrating because he did not content himself with writing a book, leaving it alone and writing another. He revised and he revised, making edition after edition of Leaves of Grass, sometimes making good choices in his revisions, most often not, and increasingly growing more tepid, more sentimental, and more of a nationalist. Well, now, it's really hard to judge him for that. This guy had written poems that were so open, so forthright. He said, you know, the body and the soul are the same thing. He said, women are equal to men in all ways, experience sexual pleasure, are creative citizens of this world. He said that the teachings of Jehovah are not worth a spurt of my seminal wet. Emily Dickinson is supposed to have opened a copy of Leaves of Grass rather than shut it. And if that is true, which I doubt, it might have been that line which would have caused her to do that. He was a poet who was willing to cast aside our sense of separateness. Every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. If that's true, how do we have to remake our society, our social mores, our relationships, if in fact we are all one body? And he believed that with all his heart. So a great visionary poet who has a fascinatingly vexed career and intriguing life. So I've been writing about that, and I'm really struggling with this book. It's been a long time. And originally I thought I could just oscillate between my life and what was this one. It's hard to make those transitions. I finished the first full draft of the book. 3 people have read it. 1 loved it, and 2 said, and have questions about the structure.
Right.
So the next step is I cut it up and I move the parts around, and somehow or other this thing is going to work. I've worked on it a long time, it's got to work. But I've never been so vexed about a book.
Well, I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
I have a question about your thematic and structural progression just through the years that you've been writing. How would you compare, perhaps the poems in your first book to more recent books?
My lines didn't change in that they've always been 4-beat lines. I'm a formalist. I've always known that. My verse looks free because it ends up with a ragged appearance. That is its formal appearance, is kind of a fireworks-like look on the page, or a tree with branches, or a person with many arms. 4 beats per line with variations. The biggest change that became conscious maybe 3 books ago is to have them all be in one clump. What's it called? Stickic? There are formal words for it. I call it a clump. I think of it as a torso, really, an intact torso. I have having been raised on Christian hymns, I have an allergy to stanzas, and that torso with an that's backwards for you, with an irregular side, it just makes me, when I look at the poem, I feel right about it. And at the beginning, I had the 4-beat lines, I had really the hymn meter, but I didn't know the look that I wanted yet. Yeah.
I was raised on Christian hymns too, but I love stanzas. And I think it's partly because my grandmother, who was the end of the world is coming soon Christian, was a quilt maker. And she liked arranging things in patterns. And so, you make these structures out of triangles or squares, and something happens as you vary them. And there's something about stanzas. It's just this wonderful way of making a pattern which exists on top of whatever the content of the poem is.
Yes,
So you got one pattern on top of another. I think it's pleasing.
Cool, I can see that, yeah.
So evolution, I've been writing poetry seriously for like 45 years, right? So it better have evolved. I'd be bored out of my mind. But I was a neo-surrealist when I was a kid, which was, my poems were all burning guitars and exploding swans and stuff like that. And that was a good place to hide, and it also had a certain intensity and lyric power. I walked away from that when I really wanted to talk about my life, and my poems became much more plain-spoken and interested in trying to say what happened and understand the context that had shaped me. And so the work was very straightforward. And in a while, I got tired of being straightforward and I wanted more music. And so, processes of evolution over time. And I think, in a way, it's like noticing what you lack. What do I see in poems that I love that I'm not doing? And it might be vision, or it might be sheer music, or the rhapsody of description. It might be a willingness to be disconsolate.
Yes, great. Thank you. Thank you. What writers in the United States and around the globe have most influenced you and your work?
Well, the first names that come to my mind are Muriel Rukeyser, Ruth Stone, Gwendolyn Brooks, and Stanley Kunitz. It's also true that many, many poets of the generation between theirs and mine, and many poets in my generation and in the generation next along to mine, approximately.
Generation.
Something like that. And then for the last 5 or 10 years, my students in the creative writing program at NYU were very lucky to be able pretty much to choose who we want, and they are astonishing to me. They represent the future, and they are very much in the way back of my mind as an audience. Though, of course, we don't think about audience while we're writing, but there's something way in the back of our minds. And the fact that they are going to make poetry what it is next, and they're already doing that, that's very moving to me. Yeah.
Thank you.
But the poets that you love, you internalize, and they become ways of thinking about a certain kind of experience or a certain kind of feeling, ways of lenses, ways of looking at things. Constantine Cavafy, the great Egyptian Greek poet who wrote the most profoundly erotic, desolate poems in which he remembers an encounter, a glancing touch from 50 years before. And in this tiny poem breaks your heart in an extremely unsentimental way without memory. The poems are like snapshots of the past that are made to take out and look at and think again about that time. Those. James Merrill, fulsomeness, style, wit, and a deep current of emotion underneath a very glamorous surface of silks and satins. Elizabeth Bishop, who looks at the world with such intensity that how she sees tells us who she is. She never says anything about herself or what's going on in her life. It all comes through the way she describes, as if she pour everything into the eye, this eye, and what will come back is the person who's doing the looking. So those would be major ones, I guess.
Wonderful, thank you. I have a couple of other questions too, but I just wondered if you might have a question for each other.
How do you do it?
What's your secret?
Yeah, that's our question. Wow. How do you do it with the precision of observation and description, which is gorgeous, and the passion of the emotional life coming through and standing with, joining each other?
But my question for you was that...
We're not doing answers. Just questions.
We're good at questions. How do you keep it up? How do you sustain it? If you all this life's work and each time I feel like in every book you push against something you don't know how to do yet. You find the courage to do something when you've found courage before. It's amazing to me. And I'm so interested in that artist who, we all know there are artists who do something wonderful and then they keep doing a version of it for the next 40 years, right? Or there are artists who do something and stop, right? You're never gonna stop. It's just not you.
Stop right here.
So tell me.
When you are in the process of writing your poems, how much research do you do?
Or tangential reading.
Or related reading.
And
Yes.
at what point?
So,
And at what point do you stop?
I'll go first this time, Mark, because I remember, well, I don't remember with that poem, but in general, there's a conflict for me. If I'm writing a poem, the poems in my books look a lot like they looked as first drafts. They've been worked on a lot, but basically they're a lot like they were as first drafts. The conflict is, I'd better not move, I'd better not sit anywhere else or change the color of the ink or anything, because it does feel as if it's just coming through me. And I want to keep that angle up or in from the unconscious going. And so occasionally I will do da-da-da-da-da-da-da. I'll do an underline where suspensory ligament is going to go. I think I may have done it with that poem, but there is a conflict because the words that I find that will go there are going to have their own music. And I'm really engaged tremendously in rhyme while I'm writing, even though it's never at the end of the line, doesn't seem probably as if I am, but I am. So if I put in sounds, those sounds are going to be calling out to my unconscious to produce matching sounds. And so if those words don't stay in the poem, so I guess for me it's a real challenge.
I'm not going to answer the question. That was a great answer. What I want to do instead is tell you that this is true. A former student now at a State University in Wisconsin, is suing her creative writing professor because the creative writing professor assigned like 5 texts that were your books, mine, and I'll have to look up who else, because she found the books degrading, focused on sexuality and a side of life she didn't want to think about. It's a Christian woman, a fundamentalist Christian woman. So, what I kind of felt like we're doing something right. Yeah. If those books mean I'm having to look at a life that I don't want to see and I don't want to know about. So that is a valuable work in the world. It's also, isn't it shocking to think that teacher could get sued? The case apparently has been thrown out of court. I'm happy to say.
Oh, good.
But I have a copy of the the brief.
Yeah,
the filing. It's quite something. You want to see it.
Wow. I do have a couple of anatomy books that I use a lot. Yeah, because I'm interested in what the names are of things. And then I have to watch that I don't load it down too much with that. But I have always loved field guides and nonfiction books and information books. And
I feel like I learn things about sex from reading poems.
Yeah.
Not recently, but and other subjects as well.
Right.
So if somebody takes that poem and gets something out of it they can use, that's so great.
Right. Well, in any art, we're sharing our intimate life of the mind, of the soul, of the emotions, of the body with each other. Ultimately, why? So that our species will last as long as possible. So we'll feel that we're all one.
And because the fire is most often in the hidden. We don't want to say.
Do you see yourself as the soloist, the conductor,
or the composer?
Or the composer? Thank you. When you write.
Do you think of something right away?
I do. I actually think of the poems as kinds of songs, and they're like jazz solos. That they're sung in particular ways. They can be varied, but there's a music that I hear. That's me being a soloist, but I'm also, of course, being the composer because I'm not the one who's going to be performing the poem most of the time. I won't be there. And so I hope that what happens on the page is enough clues are given to the reader about how to voice the poem that you know something about the architecture I'm making, but you take it and make it yours. And what you're doing is working with sound, but also association. Reading poetry is very much an invitation to reverie. The whole point of this is for you to bring your interiority to bear on the words. So we make a scaffolding. It's very personal to us. It's very precious to us, but we don't own it, you know. And reading is such a collective act of bringing your life to bear on the poem, carrying it with you. If it's a great poem, if it's one that touches you deeply, you carry it with you your whole life, and it acquires more meaning over time.
Cool. I never would have thought of that. I think when you said that, I pictured like a chorus line, as it were, but we're not dancing. A chorus, and we take turns. So I'm one of many. Therefore, I don't have to have the wisdom that this person next to me might have, or the music that that one might have. We're all trying to bring forth that which is within us as best we can. So we're one of many. And it would be composer and soloist and chorus. Yeah.
Thank you. Could you share with us any of your creative habits?
Well, they vary, which is interesting to me, because I used to have I used to work in my study. I wanted to be quiet. I had my bird bones, my beach glass, and my this and my that, and all those things needed to be there, and things that were connected to people in my life had been important. And at some point, I remember this when I lived here, I used to get annoyed if people were talking too loudly on the street because I was writing a poem. You should be quiet because you're writing a poem. You know, now I work in coffee shops. I like having some noise and interruption and other things, just reminding me there's a world out there. I think it's useful to be open to, claim what works for you. Absolutely, pay attention to what works for you, and then mess with it a little bit now and then and see where else it goes, because stepping into a different process is often a way to reach different material and different kinds of cadences, patterns.
Ballpoint pen, medium point, although I've discovered some fine points that are interesting me now. A grocery store type notebook or Staples type notebook with lines, wide ruled. Yeah, college is just too intimidating for me. And I don't feel, for me it's good to be using paper that is not made to be fancy paper. And then I'm a passionate recycler of paper because I do use a lot. And then out of 10 hand drafts, if I'm in a period of writing a lot, I might type up only 1 or 2. The others just aren't worth it. And then I type it up and print it out and correct it by hand. For me, the whole physical motion of cursive and of, my feeling that I'm kind of dancing with my poem in a way, that physical side is really important to me. Yeah.
The digital age brings us many good things, but the loss of office supplies and sort of the romance of the stationery store is pretty much gone.
As a poet and a memoirist, how do you see the relationship between the two?
Do you know what haiban are? This beautiful Japanese form where there will be a prose passage, a description of some kind of situation, and then a haiku attached to it or embedded in it, which somehow crystallizes it. It is the plucked string that vibrates. Sometimes it actually falls against it or goes in some other direction, but the relationship between the compressed and the fulsome is really intriguing to me. And what I love about writing nonfiction prose is having a big stage. And I can make so much happen and have many different things talk to each other, resonate with each other. In the first memoir I wrote is a book about grief, and in it there is some travel writing, some literary criticism, some natural history, all kinds of stuff, because I had the space to do it and to make meaning in all those ways. A poem can do that too, but it's not likely to do it for 350 pages, right? So the larger art, telling stories with context, I stopped writing poems about my family, about growing up. I sort of lost interest in it, and in part it was because I couldn't make enough happen in terms of meaning making in those poems. Whereas writing a memoir about growing up, I can think about cultural history, my family in Southerners, in a particular economic situation, as part of a suburban diaspora in the 50s, as myself as a kid of the space age, all that stuff. The ways that gender was playing out and being articulated in that time. Those are things that a poem can evoke in an image, but you don't get to really wander around and examine and pick up the parts and think about them in the same way. So I love the poem.
Okay, thank you. I think there was a question. Yes.
This question was from Mark. Mark, I think the poem was 2 seconds that you read.
Mm-hmm.
My question, I was struck by that about you having lived here in a time where we witnessed AIDS.
Yeah.
And in a time where we're witnessing this epidemic of killing Black people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea that we survived that or we lived that and now we're into this other destruction of human witnessing. Is there, as white people, how do we continue to search ourselves and invite other people to witness that?
When I was living here, some full-time for a while and then part-time, 1990 till 2005. And that, so much of it, especially the late 90s, a town, that's absolutely wrapped by loss. A funeral week. You didn't know, you would see somebody looking great in the grocery store one week and the next week they were dying and then they were back again. A sense of living in wartime with no power to do anything about it, no agency except to get people to eat, and no hope for a long time. What are human beings with no hope? What do we do? So the narrative in the mainstream media, the cultural narrative, was abandoned pariahs who were sexual deviants, and this is what they get. The narrative that I saw on these streets was compassion, incredible self-sacrifice, dedication, love, persistence, dignity. So I needed to tell those stories, and it was very much a witnessing that comes out of engagement. I think one of the reasons, Sharon was talking about poems of witness that don't work, and it's very hard for Americans often to write poetry of a political engagement because we get our news from television, their language from television. I'm really upset about Syria. And what vocabulary do I have for that comes from CNN or reading the Times, right? It's not experiential for me if I don't go there. So similarly, to me, Rise Dies, I'm outraged, but how do I witness that without being involved? What I had to do for that poem, and I struggled with this, but I think if I did not pretend to know him, but I'm really writing about time and what happens when a child's life is truncated, all of the past that was flowing into his body, all of the future that would have preceded, that's all exploded in that moment. And the poem really wants to think about the absurd waste, of terminating life in that way, interrupting the progression of time. And not especially individualizing. The details are really generic, a pocket knife, marbles, cat's collar, bell. Deliberately so, because I don't want to claim something that I don't have the right to, sort of. So maybe that's the direction towards that. I think it is crucial that white writers take on writing about race. We have said it's the problem of writers of color until really quite recently. And of course, we know that racism distorts every life in this country in one way or another. So.
Thank you. We are actually out of time for questions, but we are going to end with one poem each. So, Mark, would you like to read first?
This is a Provincetown poem, and you will remember the elementary school over there, and it was sort of high up, and it had a very sun-baked playground around it. And there was one year when you could, or maybe a couple of years, you could rent a garden plot there, and it was really not terribly promising, that soil. But I did this, and what really knocked me out about going there were the gardens of the children in the school who grew sunflowers. And the sunflowers were towering and wild at the end of the season. So this is one of those, some of the poems that I wrote about this place are direct in talking about the epidemic, and some of them are taken out of context, seem to be about something else, or perhaps are about flourishing and ending in general, or perhaps a metaphoric for the epidemic, if you read in that context. Okay, so anyway, blah, blah, blah. In the community garden. It's almost over now, late summer's accomplishment. And I can stand face to face with this music, eye to seed-paved eye with the sunflower's architecture. Such muscular leaves, the thick stems surge. Though some are still shiningly confident, others can barely hold their heads up. Their great leaves wrap the stalks like lowered shields. This one shrugs its shoulders. This one's in a rush to be nothing but form. Even at their zenith, you could see beneath the gold the end they'd come to. So what's the use of elegy? If their work is this skyrocket passage through the world, is it mine to lament them? Do you think they'd want to bloom forever? It's the trajectory they desire. Believe me, they do desire. You could say they are, one intent, finally, to be this leaping green, this bronze haze bending down. How could they stand apart from themselves and regret their passing when they are a field of lifting and bowing faces, faces ringed in flames?
Thank you.
Stanley Cunett's Ode. 95 years before he died, Stanley found an abandoned kitten in the woods of Worcester. Stanley's father had drunk Drano in a public park while Stanley had still been turning a nebula slowly taking cuneiform inside his mother. And when he found the lost cat, he took it home and gave it a box in the attic under the stars where his father was wheeling. And he raised his feline companion, I don't know, girl or boy, without his mother much noticing, hard as she worked, silent as she kept. And his pet grew, and when they got to the woods, he would take off the collar and leash, and they would frolic together. He, she would teach Stanley, already sinuous, to slink and hunt. And I don't know who it was who suddenly saw that Stanley's companion, growing stronger and bigger and lither, was a bobcat. And none of us was there the night Stanley released him, or there when it rose in him the desire to seek a feline of his own species. And when he was 98 and Elise had gone ahead, leaving her words and images behind her, casting the skin of them, I saw in a city in Ohio an elegant, shaving brush soft replica bobcat and brought it back to West 12th, along with the usual chocolates and flowers and a demo of my latest progress towards a model's sachet on the catwalk. And after that, when I'd come over, Stanley would be holding the stuffed animal and petting it, nape to rump, stub of the bob tail, 98, 99, 100, those huge, old, elegant hands stroking the world, which hummed when Stanley stroked it.